Good afternoon, everyone. This is Gretchen Wall, the coordinator of the Produce Safety Alliance and also the Northeast Extension Associate. I see a couple people still getting connected to their audio, but quite a few of you are already logged on, and I have 2 p.m. on the dot on my watch, so I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Produce Safety Alliance Produce Educators Calls. We have these monthly, and we've been doing them for a couple years now if you haven't been on these calls before. Today we're going to have a speaker from our own team, Dr. Don Stoeckel. And Don, if you wouldn't mind just advancing one slide before I turn it over to you so I can give everybody some instructions. Thanks. So everybody on this call, you are currently muted right now, but we will have some opportunity to ask questions and have some Q&A time throughout the presentation at the end. So I will give you those controls to mute and unmute your own lines later on during the presentation. But just so Don can present easily and we don't have a bunch of chatter in the background, you're all going to be muted, at least to start. Feel free to use the chat box. If you have a specific question, you can either private message myself or any one of our team, or you can send a chat to everyone in the group, and we'll do our best to get to those questions throughout, but the chat box is there for you to use. We are recording this meeting, so if you have to hop off the call at any point or you know someone that would value from listening to this information that's going to be presented today, we will be posting the recording and we do send out notes. These meetings are open to anybody. So anybody that's interested can log on, and this will actually be cataloged on our website. It is under the Resources tab, and there's a drop down that says Educators Calls. And we put on all of the meeting recordings and the meeting notes, and then we'll also post the date of the next call. We typically try to have these calls on a monthly basis, but depending on our team schedule and depending on what's going on in the production season, you know, summer is typically a little bit slower because all of you are typically out in the field working with growers. But we do have a good lineup coming next month. We'll talk about that at the end of this call. But again, if you need to hop off, this is going to be recorded and we will share it via the listserv. If you didn't originally get this email direct from us, you can sign up for the educators listserv by emailing Michelle Humiston, and I will type this in the box. It's mmc15@cornell.edu, and she can add you to the listserv. This is a different listserv than if you get our general listserv emails from the Produce Safety Alliance. This is something that you'd have to be request to be added to. I think there's about 300 or 400 folks that are on this particular group, and it's specifically geared towards educators. So folks that are PSA trainers or just doing GAPS trainings. We try to do these meetings to help inform questions that you all have. So we're always open to additional topics of interest. If there's something that you guys really want to learn about or you really want to hear a particular speaker, please do reach out to me or any one of our team members with those suggestions, because we're happy to provide that information if we know that it's of interest to everybody. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don Stoeckel, who's going to go through his presentation today, and the topic is on exemptions and exclusions to the produce safety rule. So take it away, Don.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
Perfect. For better or worse. I should start by saying that I'm the Midwest Regional Extension Associate. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, covering most of the states between the mountains and north of the Mason-Dixon. There are a lot of names on the list of attendees who I don't recognize, so now we know each other a little bit, and thank you for coming for this fascinating topic. The topic of coverage and exclusions, I guess I wouldn't have expected that I'd be the person to give a webinar on this, but luckily I got some really nice comments as we were going through the review process that made me feel comfortable. One of which was, I'm really glad you guys take on the challenging topics, and the other one was, you have a really interesting sense of humor. So we will try to get through this and give you information that I hope is useful to you. The reason why we chose that title was about the rabbit hole, was because as a trainer, when we stand up in front of the room and someone in the room is totally confused about coverage and exclusions, that rabbit hole can take you a long distance and eat a lot of time and cause some I guess, some delays and some frustrations with unclear communication. So the point of what we're trying to go through in this call is to help you as trainers navigate that territory. And if somebody does need help on this topic during the course, to help you consistently answer the questions quickly, accurately, and in a way that's practical for the growers who are asking the questions. We did create a sheet of resources with URLs for all of you, because this is not my area of expertise. I'm not a subject matter expert on legal definitions and so on. Most of the information that's in this webinar comes from FDA conversations, FDA documentation, and conversations with you all, and some information that's available on the internet. So those URLs are heavily referenced in this webinar. So the Technical Assistance Network is one great avenue for getting information from FDA. We combed through a lot of guidance and other documentation. The Produce Safety Network personnel have been extremely generous with their time, as have some subject matter experts and some policy analysts. I put a couple of the names of folks at FDA who have been particularly helpful as we've tried to navigate through the coverage and exemptions portions of the produce safety rule. And conversations with you as trainers, as colleagues, and with the growers in the room are the things that have caused us to look in more depth on some of these topics. So here's the deal. The PSA grower training curriculum is just 2 slides. Coverage and exclusions are a big deal. We put in 2 slides and the FDA decision tree as part of the curriculum, because as we went through the development process of the Produce Safety Alliance curriculum, and we got input from hundreds of growers, farmers, of regulators, stakeholders, the conventional wisdom was that farmers don't spend their time and money unless they know that they need to spend their time and money, and there was a good chance that they were going to look and make sure that they knew about the exemptions, the coverage and exclusions before they spend a day and $100. In some cases, we were wrong in that assumption, and we find that a lot of growers do need help figuring out whether they're covered, what are the compliance dates, what are the meanings of the definitions, and in particular, some of the market pressures that might make those questions void if they have to cover the rule anyway. There are 2 slides that are in the PSA curriculum. Are this one about the mandatory, about the FSMA produce safety rule, and it discusses it introduces the topics of what are some of the coverage and exclusions and exemptions in the produce safety rule. And it ends with the note that growers should understand and take action to reduce food safety risks whether or not they are covered. However, it is meaningful whether you are legally covered by the produce safety rule. The other one is about compliance and compliance dates. So anybody who's under the age of, say, 40 might not recognize the face, so I have a sound clip, because you'll probably recognize that. Some of you will recognize that better than you recognize the face on the slide. The produce safety rule is evolving. There are announcements frequently. They tend to come in batches about current thinking. We get guidance from FDA. We all come up with the understanding of how is this, not just the facts, but how is it significant to the farms. And some of the examples of things that have changed are the compliance date extension for Subpart E. There's a PSA supplemental slide set to help address some of those changes that are anticipated for agricultural water. We know that there's going to be a change in Subpart F, the reserved section, about time time between application and harvest. And then there is an enforcement discretion policy that came out in January about coverage if the deciding factor of whether you're a farm or a facility is based on ownership or business structure. FDA doesn't plan to enforce those distinctions. And there's enforcement discretion also for written assurances in the customer provisions policy portions of the produce safety rule, and we'll talk about some of those. So the rule evolves. The point is that the information is present. It's not emphasized in the standardized curriculum. It is present, so it's an opportunity for us to talk to the growers about this. Not all of the participants need that additional information, but for those who do, we want to help you get that information because it is useful to a lot of growers and it helps PSA trainers effectively answer questions. The other really important thing is to stay current on the updates and clarifications, and hopefully, and that's one of the things we try to do as part of this educators forum. So one of the first things that growers are often confused about is that inspections for the produce safety rule are required. They may not be annual, and they're different from an audit program such as a GAPS audit and a GAPS certification. The audit programs are voluntary. They result in certification. Usually it's an annual certification. One thing that is sometimes useful is to go ahead and describe the differences between inspections and audits at the beginning of a course so that growers don't get confused and spend time later trying to catch up and figure out why this is different from the audit programs that they're used to. There is a PSA fact sheet behind the References and Resources tab in the PSA Grower Training Manual. Betsy Bin was the author on that, and it describes the difference between inspections and audits. And there are also a large number in the references, the resource that I created for you all. There's a number of Kansas made one, Michigan made one, so some other resources that can be useful to help describe that difference. Other resources that are available from FDA: coverage and exclusions guidance, inflation adjusted cutoff values. I don't need to read all these to you. We're going to refer to these resources as we go through the coverage and exclusions. I just want you to know that these are some of the key things that we talk about during the course when we answer questions, and that those URLs are in the resources sheet that we're handing out. The important thing for trainers is to know your audience. Some of those resources might be especially important to the audience that's in the room. You might consider printing some of those documents to distribute, especially if you have an audience that needs the documentation, because we don't like them to just believe what we say at the front of the rule as factual. We want to give them some backup documentation so that they can stand by that documentation. And especially when we're dealing with plain or Amish or audiences that otherwise don't have access to the internet, that paper copy might be very important. It's just meaningful to be able to hand out a paper copy sometimes. Know that some of the materials, especially the coverage flowchart, is already in the PSA Grower Training Manual, and we'll talk about that right now. This is really the backbone of educational materials when it comes to the coverage and exemptions and exclusions. This is in the PSA Grower Training Manual. It's available online. It's on the references list, and many state extension agencies and departments of agriculture have converted this into some question and answer decision trees that help a grower know whether they're covered or not covered or exempt. Some of those resources are also in the list. So what's a good idea is to have the participants look at this document before the training so that they don't commit their day, commit their travel, commit their registration fee, if there is one, and find out when they get to the training that they didn't have to be there. Like I already pointed out, that chart is widely available to you, and that there are also a lot of other resources online, including some flow charts to help growers walk through the exemptions exclusions. We're going to walk through them today in the next dozen or so slides. Starting with the first box on that flow chart is who is covered. I'd like to take it from the perspective of who's not covered. If you're not a farm, you're not covered. If your farm doesn't grow, harvest, pack, or hold covered produce, you're not covered by the produce safety rule. And then farms with total produce sales less than 25,000, 3 years rolling average adjusted for inflation to 2011. That number for 2018 is 26,999. So 7 years has caused inflation has caused that number to go up by nearly $2,000. And there's a value that FDA publishes in March covering what is the current average for the prior 3 years of produce sales that go into the that constitutes the cutoff for whether a farm is covered or not covered by produce safety rule. Some things to know are the definitions and the impact of those definitions on a business. You have to know the definition of a farm in order to know whether a business is a farm, because sometimes that definition of a farm can be surprising. A business that does nothing but harvest produce or does nothing but hold produce can be a farm, depending on some situations. It's not just red barns and growing fields. Farms covers a lot more, many different types of businesses. The activities that are classified as growing, harvesting, packing, or holding covered produce, those are the specific covered activities. So if a farm isn't doing those covered activities, well, then it's not covered by the produce safety rule. And that $25,000 cutoff, not only do we need to keep up with the inflation adjusted value, but we need to know that it applies to all the produce sold. The definition of the produce then is really important. But it's all the produce sold, including exempt produce, produce that is rarely consumed raw. We'll talk about that in a minute, including produce that is sold into canning. So it's not just covered produce; it's all the produce, and that's something that sometimes it's hard to keep straight with. Now we go into food that's not covered. So we just talked about farms that aren't covered. Food that's not covered. If it's not in the definition of produce, and things like mushrooms, nuts, typical fresh vegetables, typical fresh fruits are the things that are in the definition of produce. Sprouts are also in the definition of produce. Food is not covered if it's not in the definition of a raw agricultural commodity. It's not covered if it's produced for personal or on-farm consumption, and it's not covered if it is on this list of 34 specific things. So I think you know that because you've read it in the in that flow chart. But some things to keep track of: know that food grains, most other agronomic crops, aren't produce. So if you're talking about feed corn, that's not going to be produce, but sweet corn is going to be produce. The consumer can't be a business. I got clarification on this through Produce Safety Network this morning, and it was good to get some clarification. The specific question was on farm consumption. What if you have a restaurant on your farm and the food is consumed on your farm? Since a consumer cannot be a business, the food produced for on-farm restaurants is covered by the produce safety rule. It can be sold to a qualified end user. That's a different kind of exemption, but it's not covered by the produce safety, but it is covered by the produce safety rule because it is not consumed on the farm by a consumer, because a customer can't be a business, or a consumer can't be a business. And then finally, the 34 items on that rarely consumed raw list, I would encourage trainers not to try to justify those 34 rarely consumed raw items, because what that can lead to is an argument about whether it is rarely consumed raw or not. And that's in terms of the common meaning of what does it mean to be rarely consumed raw. What is important is, what did the FDA define rarely consumed raw as? There's a fact sheet that goes through this system, the statistical data that FDA used to decide which items were rarely consumed raw. That list could be changed as consumption trends change. And for things that are not on the list, but that are actually in lowercase letters, rarely consumed raw, there is a variance process that can be initiated by states, Indian tribes, or other countries in which the organization can request that a item of produce that's not on the list be given a variance on the basis of being rarely consumed raw. So that's one process to go through to add things to get things outside of coverage if they are not on that rarely consumed raw list. Then we move into food that's exempt. Produce that receives commercial processing that significantly that adequately reduces the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. In other words, the kill step for pathogens. The produce safety rule gives 3 subparts of the produce safety rule. I went ahead and looked them up for your benefit, so you know that 113 is thermally processed low acid foods, etc. Barb, I saw your note, and I will address that at the end of this slide. Thank you. So it's processed in accordance with those requirements. It's treated with a validated process such as commercial canning for tomato paste or shelf-stable tomatoes, or processed by refining, distilling, such as spirits, wine, beer, or similar products. So those are some of the exemptions to the produce safety rule. It's an exemption from most of the rule, but not all the rule. There are still some requirements. Produce that is exempt because it is processed has to have a statement at sale that says it's not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms, and there needs to be written assurance from the buyer that the produce will be processed after sale. So the question was the $25,000 exemption. It is all produce, including produce for thermal processing, including produce that's rarely consumed raw. All produce sold by the farm counts toward that $25,000 cutoff, which is in current terms $26,999. The next thing and this one is often tricky for people, is the qualified exemption. There's a qualified exemption for businesses that sell less than $500,000 annually in food, and that's an adjusted value, not just produce, but food. The majority of the produce that's sold, more than 50%, has to go to qualified end users. This qualified end user can be the consumer, or it can be a restaurant or a retail food establishment within the same state, reservation, or within 275 miles. And that is, again, all food sales, including meat, value-added, animal feeds, things like that. So a couple of things for trainers, aside from just the basic value of those words. Know those definitions. That food, and I probably wouldn't have put the word food in the definition of food, but they chose to do that. Food means articles that are food or drink that's used for men or other animals. It includes chewing gum, and it includes anything that is used as a component of food. So food's a pretty broad definition. Restaurants prepare and sell foods directly to consumers, which I think you would have guessed, but it's important to know for our growers that within the definition of restaurants are businesses like cafeterias, catering facilities, and nursing and kitchens. So restaurants is more of a broad definition. It's not just the Chipotle. It can be a lot of different types of businesses. Same for retail food establishments. Retail food establishments sell food directly to the consumer as the primary function. It includes grocery stores, which I think we would have expected, vending machines, which I might not have expected, and it specifically calls out farm roadside stands, CSAs, and farmers markets, which is good for our growers to know. That $500,000 in food really trips people up. So the first thing to know about that $500,000 is that it's the total food. We already talked about that. It is inflation adjusted, so the current value is $539,982 for the years 2015 to 2017. Those are the 3 prior years to 2018. It's the upper limit for eligibility of a qualified exemption. The FDA calls it the cutoff. That value includes, and this is a clarification we got just recently also, the value of byproducts like cottonseed oil. So in some cases, a non-food, something that's typically considered non-food like cotton, can have a byproduct that is used as a food item like cottonseed oil, and that the value of that product does count as food in this particular cutoff. That one is different from the $500,000 in produce sales. That's important for business size definitions. You know that you saw on one of the earlier slides that the compliance dates are staggered according to business size. The largest business size sells more than $500,000 in annual produce sales on average. That's not going to be adjusted for inflation. Sales to qualified end users. Some other tips on those definitions. Animal feed is usually, I have been telling people for about 2 years that animal feed can't be a sale to a qualified end user because cows don't have credit cards. You can't sell the animal feed directly to the consumer. But one thing that's interesting is that pet shelters and kennels that serve food to animals are restaurants. So animal feed could be sold to a restaurant, a pet shelter, or a kennel, and that would count as a qualified end user sale. Another surprise maybe is that all direct sales to consumers count because there's no distance limit. So internet sales to a consumer count because you don't have to worry about that distance. The distance limit, the state reservation and 275-mile limit, is the distance between the location of the farm that grew the produce and the location of the restaurant or retail food establishment. It's not to the location of the point of sale. And that was clarified as indirectly in response to comment 102 in the preamble. So just a clarification, and thank you, Kara. Oh, well, we'll get to it. There's some dialogue in the chat box, and I'm having trouble multitasking, but we'll work it out. If we don't get to those questions, we'll deal with them at the end. The sales to qualified end users, just like the other, it's a partial exemption. There are some requirements. If a food packaging label is required, then by January 1st of 2020, the business has to disclose on the label the complete business address of the farm, even if they're qualified exempt. If the label is not required, then during the general compliance date, whether that's January 26th of 2019 or 2020, disclosing at the point of sale on a placard or some other, or on the invoice or some other way, the complete business address of the farm. The other requirement for qualified end users is there's a record keeping requirement. You have to keep the receipts to justify the eligibility for a qualified exemption, and there has to be an annual review of those records to support it. When we get to sales to qualified end users, sometimes it helps me to just draw a picture of it. So if you have the farm in the middle growing food, and the sale is to a restaurant, a retail food establishment, or a consumer that's within the same state, the same reservation, or within 275 miles, it is a sale to a qualified end user. If it's outside those limits and it's to a consumer, it is a sale to a qualified end user, because the sale to a consumer is always sale to a qualified end user. But the restaurant or the retail food establishments, if they're outside that boundary, it's not a sale to a qualified end user. So how does that get weird? Because there's always a way for it to get weird. It gets weird because how do you decide where a company like Chipotle or McDonald's or Kroger or Wegmans is located? They have a lot of different locations. So which one do you choose? You could choose the corporate headquarters if corporate is paying the invoice for the food. You could choose a retail sales location, even if there are several of them, or you could choose where is the food going after the sale, especially if it's going to a warehouse for storage and then it gets distributed to one or multiple retail locations. Clarification from the Produce Safety Network, and thanks again to them for being so available and so generous with their time and efforts helping us understand these things, is that the distance between the farm and the qualified end user that's important is where is the food going after purchase. So food bought for a grocery store chain or a restaurant chain that's going to a distribution warehouse would not be a sale to a qualified end user according to current understanding, even if that warehouse isn't a separate business from the retail food establishment or restaurant, based on the requirement, based on whether or not that location is required to register as a facility. And I assume that that's going to lead to some questions, and hopefully we can get some clarifications as guidance comes out. So there are details, right? A lot of these things, you look at them at face value, you think about them at face value, but it's not until somebody asks you a question that you say, oh, I actually need to get more details on that before I can really understand it and what it means to you as a farm. We should always recognize that the rule's new, that trainers should recognize that there's some evolution in this rule, so we look for updates and new answers. Just to reiterate that we have a lot of different resources available to us, and we've discussed some of those as we went through the first part of the presentation. TAN responses represent current thinking on some of those topics, but they're only released to the individual who asked. So I do want to put in a plug for NECAFS, which has a clearinghouse of resources, and that they are working toward a searchable database of user-submitted TAN questions and responses. So if you have some TAN questions and responses that you think are valuable for people, and you're willing to release those TAN questions and responses so that we can all learn from them, I would encourage you to submit those through the clearinghouse. If you go to NECAFS, and they have a button for the clearinghouse, and you could voluntarily submit. It's not up yet. I think it's going to be up in the next week or two, to voluntarily submit those questions. So hold tight, but be thinking, and maybe compile your 10 questions if you do want to contribute those so people can see them. Don't forget about Extension, State Departments of Health, and EG, and other NGO, non-government organizations that are great resources. And then I almost forgot to put into the presentation that there's a wide range, a lot of resources. I mean, the Produce Safety Alliance was developed in part to provide resources that are needed to understand the rule to stakeholders, to those who are covered by the rule. And we've developed quite a collection of materials and that listserv. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's a federal regulation, but I should say that what we've been talking about is what is in the federal regulation, but in many cases, the states are the ones who are going to be enforcing the regulation, depending on what the structure is for enforcement in that state. So keep in contact with your state's agency that's responsible for compliance, because the state may be doing things that are beyond what the federal regulation requires. There may be a requirement for a qualified exempt farm to have a person trained on the PSA grower training course, or some other way to meet 21 CFR 11222C, depending on what state you're in. There might be different requirements for how a qualified exempt state farm demonstrates eligibility for that exemption. There may be differences state by state as to whether that qualified exempt farm can request a voluntary inspection. The things that we can share with you as the Produce Safety Alliance, and I think FDA is under the same general constraint, is, well, this is what the rule says, and this is what we understand from the rule. But keep in mind that there may be a layer of state requirements and compliance information that's on top of that. I was asked to point out that NASDA has a proposed uniform model enforcement strategy to try to harmonize how states are doing their enforcement, and we hope that will, in many ways, ensure that people are measured against the same yardstick state by state, but states do have some discretion as to how they wish to do things. An example about how language might be interpreted differently. There's a line in 112.6 to 112.6 that says that a qualified end user, a farm that is eligible for a qualified exemption has modified labeling requirements. It must include prominently and conspicuously, et cetera, the farm where the produce was grown. That gets interpreted variously as who is selling the produce, as opposed to who actually grew the produce. In the notes of this slide, when you see those that are posted, you'll see that there was a TAN response that said the farm that is relevant is the farm that has the qualified exemption. So that would be the sign on the left. But the language of the rule, where the produce was grown, would imply that it has to be the sign on the right. So we have gotten information from FDA that for FDA's purposes and for compliance and instructions to the inspectors, the sign on the left is what FDA is going to be looking for. But just be aware that the language of the rule implies that the sign on the right, and there's nothing that says a farm cannot give more than what is required. Another thing that has been somewhat confusing to me anyway, and maybe you bring up points that concern you. 112.5 says that a qualified end user is that a farm may be eligible for a qualified exemption if it sells food directly to qualified end users, more than half the food directly to qualified end users. And there have been a lot of questions about sales through auctions, cooperatives, food hubs, or even informal sharing arrangements. If the auction cooperative or food hub is selling more than half of its food, to consumers, it may qualify as a retail food establishment under that definition. So that's something to be aware of. To recap what we know about qualified end users, that if the farm is selling directly to the consumer, to a restaurant that is serving to the consumers, to a retail food establishment that's selling it to consumers, and they're within that, and especially the bottom two are within, well, just those bottom two are within that 275 miles, same state, same reservation, then it would count as a sale directly to a qualified end user. The question comes up is for co-ops and food hubs, you have multiple farms that are selling through a co-op or a food hub. Is that a direct sale? The answer is maybe, and it somewhat depends on how the money flows. If the co-op or the food hub is buying the food from the farm and then reselling it to qualified end users, then you would have to, you should look into whether or not that sale from the farm to the cooperative or the food hub is a sale to a qualified end user. Another situation is sales directly to end users through auctions. The food goes through an auctioneer and then it gets sold to a variety of customers. Again, there's the question of how does the money flow? If the auction doesn't ever buy the produce, then there's a better chance that it's a sale to a qualified end user. But the other thing to be aware of is that records are required to demonstrate your eligibility for a qualified exemption. So make sure that the auction is providing the sales receipts, the records to the grower, so that the grower knows who ultimately had bought their produce and whether that buyer is a qualified end user. For those, I call them mediated sales, just as a note that businesses, for those of you who work a lot with cooperatives or auctions I just lost the word for the other one, but anyway, you get the idea. Anybody who's working with those organizations, if they control the covered produce and they carry out covered activities, they may be either a farm or a facility, even if they never own the produce. And those secondary activities, farm activities, would be harvesting, packing, or holding, whereas a facility, packing, holding, or manufacturing. So it can be valuable to know what are the functions that the auction cooperative or hub actually participates in. Do they have to register as a facility? FDA's guidance in the registration document is if they're solely a location to meet, sell, and transfer produce, then they're probably not going to be considered a facility because they don't hold the produce. But just be aware as you're working with your stakeholders that holding includes things like loading or placing food in a vehicle or a building. Holding includes storing, and we haven't gotten clarity yet on whether storing for 15 minutes during a sale counts as holding, or if we're talking only about storing overnight or for 24 hours to count as holding. Putting it in a cooler, or putting it in a freezer to maintain the frozen state, not to freeze it, but to maintain the frozen state. Those are all things that count as holding. Things that don't count as holding are labeling, including putting stickers on, and removing or trimming parts of a raw agricultural commodity. So be aware of those things that might lead to a facility, to a auction or a co-op being considered a facility. So the summary thoughts that I got from everyone who helped put this together were that the answers are very situational, and to be sure to ask enough questions to understand what the grower's actual situation is so that you can use some of the concepts that we presented today to give reliable and accurate and useful answers. I know that I started to ignore the chat box because it was being hard to focus. So
Don, I've got that organized here.
Great.
If you want to move to questions, I think maybe it's best to answer those questions as they came in the order of the chat box.
Perfect.
But I did get some messages that didn't go to everybody, comments and stuff while you were presenting. So I think maybe the first one that we can revisit is actually going back to the topic of variances, where you introduced that at the very beginning in relation to some of the commodities that are rarely consumed raw. And the comment was that there potentially are some restrictions because it is needs-based, based on local conditions, and that you would need to be able to justify a new rarely consumed raw commodity within the requirements of the variance petition. So I'm going to unmute the lines. So if you guys can all make sure that you are on mute, because Michelle Smith was the one that provided this comment, and she might have additional insight.
Good, because I was totally about to ask Michelle if she could help me out with that one, since she is my source for that kind of information.
Yeah, so just before we turn over to Michelle, I just unmuted everybody's lines. So if you are on a phone or you're logged into the computer, please mute your phones in order for this to work. Okay, I'm going to have to start muting people that I see. Okay. I think I got most of the background noise. So Michelle Smith, are you able to unmute your line and provide some feedback on this topic?
Okay, I've just done that. And Don, first of all, you did a really excellent job. I was taking notes. You did make a comment saying that the variance petitions in subpart P might be a way to potentially expand the list of rarely consumed raw commodities. And I'll admit right up front that I'm not one of the subject matter experts working on rarely consumed raw, and so I don't have firsthand information about the options that they've been discussing with respect to keeping that list up to date over time. And if there's anybody on the call who's involved in that, they can speak up. What I wanted to say about the variance petitions is that I'm very hopeful that the variance petitions work out to be a way, like Congress intended, to provide opportunities for diverse farming operations that may have reasons to request a variance. My caution is that the variance petitions need to be able to justify why the petition is necessary in light of local growing conditions. And the second category of requirements would be that the different measures that someone's asking to follow would meet the same level of public health protection and not adulterate the food. I think that it is going to take some period of time, both for petitioners and for FDA, to get experience and determine the scope of what would fall within necessary in light of local growing conditions. I would say that on the brighter side, all of this is going to be a very transparent process. So if we receive petitions, they'll be posted, and there will be an opportunity for other folks to see those petitions, to comment on those petitions, to make use of any information that's in those petitions that may support something that they themselves want to do. So, but this is just one more of those things that's brand new and may evolve over time with experience. So, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, Don, let me get back to the list here. So the next question that came in was actually from Kara, which you started to answer, but the question, just to return to it, was, her question was, you clarify that the majority of food has to be sold directly, not just the majority of produce. So then she provides an example. So a larger grain farmer with bigger wholesale markets with a smaller direct produce operation would not fall into a qualified exemption. And Kara, if you have anything to add on to that, or you want to clarify that better, I'm just copying and pasting from what the chat box said. Feel free to chime in now.
I think that's a great clarification. Kara, did I speak over you?
No, I just said that's what I meant.
Okay.
That's enough information. You can answer.
Thanks for pointing that out, because I think that's something that's not obvious to a lot of people. So thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to go to the next question down on the list, Don?
Please do. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The next one that came in was from, not sure the name, but it was NKC 93456. And the question was about produce used in a restaurant that is on a farm, as Don mentioned, counts towards sales amount. So one, I think the first question is the restaurant also a farm? And two, is that not considered on-farm consumption? We may need a little bit of clarification on this question because it's not reading completely clear to me.
Hi, this is Sarah Coburn in Alaska. And we have two types of operations. So we do have restaurants that grow quite a lot of produce for consumption in their restaurant. When we've talked to FDA in the past, they've said this would not be covered, especially if it was regulated under food safety. In our state, food safety and sanitation would be monitoring those restaurants. But then what I was understanding from your slides earlier is that produce would be covered. So I have a question about that, where everything they're growing is for consumption at the restaurant. And we also have folks that are growing. Some is being sold off-site and some is being sold at a restaurant or a store on the property.
So my understanding from the conversations I've had is that the farm that's consumed on farm is, just to reiterate, food that's consumed on farm is not covered by the produce safety rule, but that because the term consumer cannot be a business, if it's being consumed in a restaurant, then that is not then it's not excluded from the rule for that reason. Is my understanding from today's conversation. So you have a farm that has an on-farm restaurant, and it serves the food through the restaurant to consumers, and the restaurant is a business, then that would be covered under the produce safety rule, although it is a sale to a consumer, so it's a sale to a qualified end user. So if the business is making less than selling less than $500,000 in food, then they would still be eligible for their qualified exemption. If it's more than $500,000 in food, then it would become covered produce at a covered farm, is my understanding of it.
And all of the food sold in that restaurant is food sales, correct? So if the restaurant is grossing over $500,000, that to me says even if they have a small, produce component that they're growing, at that point, they would be a fully covered farm.
So that gets to your second question about whether the restaurant is part of the farm. And there I would have to go to the definition of a farm, which is the same general location and the same management. If the restaurant's in the same location and the same management and it's the same business as the farm, then I would think that it could be part of the farm. But if it's different management, then it would not be part of the farm, is my understanding under that definition. Does that make sense? And can anybody else help clarify? Because this is not my area of expertise.
I think that helps. I was just surprised by that slide that could be considered covered. So I think we'll need to follow up with FDA more.
That would probably be a great 10 question to get to get a broader piece of input written from the FDA on that.
And Don, I think there's actually a relevant follow-up question that goes along with this that gets into breaking up businesses into multiple entities.
Yes.
So someone provided a follow-up to Kara's question where they said, okay, you have somebody, multi-generational farm, where you have a larger grain farmer has one of their children come back to do produce sales, and the farm's grain sales are greater than $500,000 a year, but the produce farm is primarily doing direct sales. So does it make more sense to break off those businesses and do separate Schedule F on taxes so that you can kind of have that separation where you would have that exemption?
Right. And that's whenever I get that question, I recommend that the person talk to their lawyer, to find out whether that's a legal move or if it's not a legal move. Who can help me here? I read in the last 2 or 3 days, it was a credible source that said we do not feel that splitting a business for purposes of meeting a qualified exemption is going to be enough to qualify as separate businesses, to split the farm. Can somebody help me remember where that came from? It was a Produce Safety Alliance forward, I think, but I can't remember where I saw it. But I think it would not be a question that's relevant. Yeah, go ahead.
Don, I think I remember a preamble comment that talks about splitting farms for that purpose. I will look and I'll put it into chat if I find it.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Don. This is Tucker from Vermont.
Hey, Tucker.
I just wanted to chime in because we had we were on a farm in a very similar situation to the scenario that Alaska mentioned about the restaurant and the farm. And I think from your discussion, it's pretty much what we figured out after much kind of back and forth. But just one of the finer points that came up for us was this was a farm, part of a larger organization that had a restaurant as well. So they're all under one management. And they were producing for the restaurant. And the issue came down to whether that was being sold to the restaurant or not considered sales. And ultimately, we kind of decided that it wasn't considered sales because it's within one organization, one management.
Oh.
And the sales is important because if they have produce sales under 25,000, they might not be covered at all. So that's just another example for you.
So the farm gave the produce to the restaurant, so it didn't.
Well, it's all one business, so
right.
It's providing the produce to the restaurant for the restaurant to sell as food sales.
Okay, and just to be clear, then the sales of the food at the restaurant was not covered by produce safety rule, or it was covered by produce safety rule?
So their food sales would be over 500,000. However, their total produce sales were below 25,000.
Okay.
So because of that,
because they processed it. Okay.
Right.
Got it. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah. It tricked a lot of us.
Yeah. It gets convoluted really fast.
Okay, so the next question down on my list that I saw come in was about records that must be maintained by qualified exempt farms. And in the chat box, I did share a resource that the Produce Safety Alliance put together that does include part of a document where you can keep track of those sales. But I don't know if that, I think it was submitted by Vicki Smith. Vicki, if you had additional questions related to required records that you wanted to talk about.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just at the OFR training up in Vermont a couple of weeks ago, and several of our trainers, we had questions about what exact records do qualified exempt users need to maintain. And it was our understanding that it was just for labeling purposes at the market, identifying the farms where the produce is grown. But as I look at subpart O, it looks like there's additional records that need to be maintained, which would include personal hygiene, training of workers, agricultural water testing, biological soil amendment applications, dates and rates. And I didn't think all of those requirements were not requirements of a qualified exempt user. And we had a couple of discussions, and somebody was going to send a question in, but I thought I'd bring that up here.
So I'm pretty sure that the records that a qualified exempt farm are required to keep are the records of things that they're required to do. And the records of things that they're required to do have to follow follow subpart O, which is, you know, the duration of the holding of the records, and that the records must be made at the time the action is done, and so on and so forth. So the records that, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, the records that a qualified exempt farm are required to keep are their sales records and their records that help them bin those sales into qualified end user or not qualified end user.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it initially after reading the rule and going to my training, but then further review of the requirements of subpart O, and then digging into those other requirements, it would appear to a grower that they have to do water testing and they have to do training. So I just think that's one place where some growers are being confused.
Right, and we do have clarification from a reliable source. I would have to look it up to actually give you the written documentation. That the former, the simpler explanation is the accurate explanation.
Okay.
And this is Michelle Smith, just to say Don is correct. If you have a qualified exemption, you only need to keep records on those things that you are required to do. You're required to have the signage, and you're required to have sufficient documentation to support the fact that you do meet the criteria for a qualified exemption. And that's it.
Okay, because that's how I interpreted it. But then the discussion we had up in Vermont among several of our trainers was that it wasn't clear to some of the growers that they were speaking with. So I just want to bring that up. But thank you.
We've heard that confusion too.
Yeah, you're totally not alone. A lot of people have had that conversation.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the response. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is one that we've definitely heard before, and this one was related to where did the plants, let's say you're buying a celery transplant, figure into the $25,000 sales threshold? So that not the, you know, what you're harvesting to actually consume, but the plant itself that you're going to put into the ground.
I don't know the answer to that question. Do you?
Hi, Don. This is Tucker again.
Hey, Tucker.
I actually submitted a TAN question very similar to this recently. And maybe unsurprisingly, the answer was it will be addressed in guidance. But I think one thing to consider that might be beneficial is the intention of the item being sold. That might factor into the judgment. So if it's intended to be, if the intention is for it not to be consumed, so like a lettuce or a celery transplant, the intention is for it to be planted and then grown on and then later consumed, maybe it's not considered produce, but from all I know, it hasn't been answered yet.
And we've had a similar question about produce. You know, if you buy tomato from the nursery, tomato plant that already has some fruit on it, is that a food sale or is that a plant sale? And I've not tracked that particular question down, so I'm in Tucker's camp that I don't know the answer. Anybody else?
No, I would agree too. This is Gretchen. And similarly, when you get into food sales definitions, I know Kristen had this question a couple different times at her trainings where someone is selling live animals, but it's not necessarily clear whether it's going to be made into human food or animal food. It might be a sale, for example, to a kid in a program who's doing animal raising. You know, it could be a pet. So it's not entirely clear the on-hoof animals being rolled into the food, total food sales definition either. And I know we submitted a question related to that.
Right. And the one thing that we do know, just to add to that, animals on the hoof being food or not food is a question that comes up for conversation a lot. One that's less conversed about, because I think it's more clear, is corn that's sold not as food but for ethanol, for energy ethanol, is not food, but corn fed to a feedlot is a sale as food. So there's some need to understand where your market is taking the product that you're selling in order to properly bin it as food or not food.
Okay, and I realize we're getting close to the 3 o'clock hour. I had one more on my list that was submitted via the chat box, and this one was from Lee. So Lee, feel free to chime in once I read your question again if you want to clarify. But she's asking questions about if mediated sales, let's say through a cooperative, they do indeed hold the produce because the produce might be stored for several days in a walk-in cooler, then they are facilities. So what does that mean in terms of what they need to do to comply with FSMA, the produce safety rule, or some other section within FSMA? You have any clarification on that?
I can tell you what I know, which is I know the first step of that. That if the cooperative is considered a farm or a facility, then the cooperative has to follow the rules as a farm or a facility. What does it mean to the farmer? If the cooperative does not buy the food from the farm but merely mediates the sale, and that sale is to a qualified end user, it still counts as a sale to a qualified end user for the farm, even if it was mediated through a cooperative, and the cooperative is a farm or a facility, is my understanding of that situation. That's as much headway as I've made on that. Lee, was there more to it that we might be able to delve into in a useful way for you? Lee, you might be on mute. Or Lee might be gone.
She's trying to unmute herself. Let me try to get to her name in this list for some reason.
Okay.
She's having some trouble.
I'm not seeing her.
Oh, there you go. Hey, Lee, I've got you unmuted.
Oh, now you've done it. No, thank you, Gretchen. No, thank you for that answer. It mostly is good to know that there is real confusion about this, because we do have lots of situations where there's this clearly holding of produce is going on, but whether it's a farm doing it or some other entity doing it, it's really not clear. There's a lot of confusion about that, and some guidance on that would be really useful.
So we'll put that on Michelle's list of things to fight for internally.
And also, when the guidance comes out, it'll come out in draft form. So if you think additional guidance would be helpful, include that in your comments, please.
Gretchen, should I forward to the next slide?
Sure. I saw one more question come in through the chat box, so it's your discretion as to whether you want to address that now, or we can follow up with Jane via email.
I will leave it to you.
But that was all the questions that I have.
I'll discretion it back to you because I don't know whether or not we have time.
Okay, well, I think just to go back to, I think this is related, and I'm not sure, Jane, if you can unmute yourself or not. It might be easier for you to just ask this question directly, but I think this is going back to the succession planning and dividing for the purposes of FSMA.
Right, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, we can.
Okay, so I was just, an echo though. Okay, maybe that's better. So I was just wondering who decides if there is a farm that's divided because of a generational succession, or because someone who's not related is coming in and purchasing or leasing a parcel to do produce when that's different from the rest of the nature of the farm. Who's going to decide if that was done as a legitimate business decision to start a new farm or as an attempt to overcome exemption thresholds?
In terms of who decide, I think the first question is, what is a legitimate division? And I think we're going to have to wait for guidance on what are how is it decided if it's a legitimate division or if it's a division for purposes of evasion. And that's I'm sure that's somebody else's authority there. when it comes to who's going to decide on the ground, I'm sure it's going to be your inspectors, and you're in Minnesota, I think, so State Department of Agriculture, and they would be making that determination when they do your compliance inspection.
Mm-hmm.
But where they get their information is going to be a great question.
Okay.
I saw Lillian on the line. I don't know if Lillian wants to weigh in on that, not to put you under the bus there.
Well, I know Lillian, and we can follow up, and
Okay.
we have several venues where we can in Minnesota, but in light of that new law that was passed about beginning farmer tax credit, I think it's a really relevant question for Minnesota.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Lillian, Jen. I think we can follow up on that because I don't clearly know the answer to that, and we need to go through that question again.
Yeah, and I still have not found it in the preamble. I'm not sure if Kristen has yet, but wherever that line is, I think that'll give us some information in the direction to the good.
Kristen actually just dropped that in the chat box. She said the preamble comments regarding the farm definition and business structures begin with comment 74, but she didn't see it directly addressing the division of farms, but it would also make a good TAN question.
So just for those of you who haven't gone into the CFR that much, it's all spelled out there.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of time here, and I think it's very clear to everybody that there's a lot of questions surrounding this topic. And again, going back to Don's introduction to this particular webinar, I think it's going to be very specific to the situation and to the case. So we do encourage you to continue to work with the growers who have those questions, or work with us to submit those to the TAN, because I think, especially as FDA continues to work on their guidance, these are the kind of examples that they need to know are out there, because I think, especially as Tucker brought up a couple different times, we've all submitted similar questions. So it's helpful for them to know that there are these repeats and these, sort of things that happen on farms that maybe we didn't consider initially. So thanks again to Don for taking on a very challenging topic. You did a great job, Don, and I know it's not easy when you don't have a lot of the answers. But I do think the big value in this particular webinar is recognizing all the resources that do exist right now that can help inform some of the guidance that we give to growers. As part of the meeting wrap-up, Don mentioned, and I dropped a bunch of different links in the chat box, but we will be sending out a resource of a ton of different links that he mentioned throughout his presentation that relate to this topic. So things like the inflation-adjusted values and other information that we know from going down this rabbit hole for a very long time that will be helpful for you as educators. So again, if you're not on our current listserv, be sure to send Michelle Humison, mmc15@cornell.edu, an email, and she can add you to this group so that you get those meeting notes and you get more information about our upcoming meetings. So tentatively, we are going to host our next call on June 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And I should have updated the slide before Don put it up here, but we do have a topic planned, and we're going to be talking about lead trainer challenges and challenges of becoming a lead trainer, just in terms of areas of education and experience and background, if you're interested in becoming a lead trainer that you want to pursue in your professional development. So that'll be the topic for June's meeting. I will be sending out more information through the listserv. I'll also include the link to that meeting in the notes, and then it's always, as usual, posted on our website along with a meeting recording for today's call and the notes and the information for the June meeting. So with that, Don, do you have anything else to add?
No, just thanks for your patience and for listening. It's a convoluted topic, and I hope this helps out. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks again, Don. And we hope to see you all back for June's meeting. If you have any questions in the interim, feel free to visit our website or contact any one of the PSA team. As you guys know, or hopefully know, we have regional extension associates beyond just Don in the Midwest. We have Donna Paul, Connie Fisk, Kristen Woods, And then Robin, Michelle, and myself are in the Northeast. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to facilitate submitting TAN questions, happy to point you to the information we know as we, really try to dig into this topic and get some help for growers. So with that, I'd like to say thanks for everyone for joining, and we'll talk to you in June.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Thank you.